And as I think we've just hit the 1 o'clock Pacific mark, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and we'll get started. Perfect. So again, we'd really like to start off this program by saying how grateful I am to be teaching, learning, and living on the traditional territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people who incorporate into their practice observation and storytelling and oral history, and that really helps inform the best practices of OceanWise, both our education and research teams. And we always look forward to opportunities to share and speak and connect with both our local environments and the broader global environments as we are connecting and learning about the Taiwanese white dolphin today. I'd like to give a really warm welcome to Dr. Lauren Dares, and I think you should have presenter ability now. I will turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Danica. I'm just going to share my screen with you guys so you can see all the awesome pictures of these cool guys. So are we good? Everybody can see that? Awesome. Cool. So I'm going to be talking today about the Taiwanese white dolphin, which was one of the focuses of my PhD research, and members of our research team here at OceanWise continue to be involved with their conservation going forward. So let's start off really big picture. What is a humpback dolphin? Genus Sousa actually makes up all of the humpback dolphin species that are found throughout the world. These are estuarine and coastal animals that are found in the coastal waters throughout the southeastern Atlantic all the way to the western Pacific Ocean. So there are several different species of humpback dolphin. In the Atlantic Ocean, there's the Atlantic Ocean humpback dolphin, the Indian Ocean humpback dolphin, the Indo-Pacific humpback dolphin, and the Australasian humpback dolphin. So you can see from these illustrations that all of these humpback dolphin species look a little bit different, and there's still been some sort of figuring out of their taxonomy. This is a fairly recent paper that this map is from that was actually describing the Australasian humpback dolphin. You can see there's some overlap between the Indian humpback dolphin and the Indo-Pacific humpback dolphin in their range. So we're still sorting out where exactly those two species are separated. But the focus of my talk today will be primarily on the Indo-Pacific humpback dolphin, which I might refer to as just humpback dolphins. I will try and refer to them as Taiwanese or Taiwanese white dolphins, but I might slip up and call them humpback dolphins here and there, but we're all talking about the same animals here. So in Chinese waters, there are a few different populations of humpback dolphins. So thousands and thousands of years ago, there's a pretty good chance that humpback dolphins ranged very widely throughout all coastal waters. They very likely had a continuous distribution all along the coast of China. But over time, environmental changes and potentially human developments over time have made it so that these populations are separated by stretches of coastline. So you can see in this map that all of the blue areas are actually sort of established populations where there are studies ongoing. And I tried to sort of highlight the study areas for all of these populations. And there are some other places of note where there have been sort of anecdotal reports of humpback dolphins sighted in these areas, but there isn't necessarily a full population there. And you'll also notice that I've highlighted the Eastern Taiwan Strait in a different color. So this is because dolphins that are found along the west coast of Taiwan are actually separated from the populations along the coast of China by the deep waters of the Taiwan Strait. So there is a channel that is about, at its shallowest part, probably about 50 meters deep, but much deeper in other parts, that separates these animals that are, again, very coastal and found in estuaries. They don't really cross deep waters, so change of individuals between this population in Taiwan and the other populations that are found along the coast of China. These animals probably got there at some point during the last ice age. There would have been much lower sea levels, and so there was potentially a land bridge between Taiwan and the mainland that these animals would have followed those coastal waters and made their way out to Taiwan. And then as the ice age ended and the glacier started to melt, seas began to rise, they became separated from the rest of humpback dolphins. And today, the animals that are found along the coast of Taiwan are known as the subspecies Sousa chinensis taiwanensis, or the Taiwanese white dolphin. And those found in Chinese waters are Sousa chinensis chinensis, the nominate subspecies that all of the other populations fall under, which in China, they're commonly referred to as Chinese white dolphins. So a little bit more background information on the Taiwanese white dolphin. They have been a recognized subspecies as of 2015, and they are Taiwan's only endemic cetacean, which means that they're only found in the waters of Taiwan, and so not anywhere else in the world. And so there are other cetacean species that are found in Taiwan, but they are also found in other waters and in the waters of other countries, so they're not considered endemic just to Taiwan's waters. And Indo-Pacific humpback dolphins, Taiwanese white dolphins, are the only cetacean species that are really sighted with any regularity along the west coast of Taiwan. So there have been historical records of these animals in the eastern Taiwan Strait over time, sort of fishermen seeing these kind of strange pink animals out there while they're out on their boats. But these were all sort of anecdotal reports and unconfirmed until 2002, when a group of researchers went over and did some exploratory surveys. And so we say they were scientifically discovered in 2002. Following this discovery, dedicated surveys were organized in 2007 and have been going on every summer since. Information from these initial surveys, even in the first couple of years, was enough for the IUCN, the International Union on the Conservation of Nature, to designate these animals as critically endangered. There were so few of them being seen that even with very little information, research has only been going on for about a year. It was enough to say that these animals do meet the critically endangered designation. And more research over time has allowed us to estimate that as of 2012, there were fewer than 75 individuals, and that number has been decreasing ever since. So what does it look like trying to survey or gather data on Taiwanese white dolphins? Surveys have been going on along the west coast, again, since 2007, following zigzag transects. So these transect lines have been set up, and you basically go out on a small vessel and travel these transect lines looking for dolphins, recording where you're traveling to see them so we know where we've spent more time. And when we actually come across dolphins, we record things like an estimate of the number of dolphins we're seeing in the group, try and take photographs of individuals, spending lots of time making sure to get both sides of every single animal as much as possible. And when we're able, we would take environmental measurements like sea surface temperature, salinity, and water depth, in case that information was useful sort of going forward. So photographic identification is really important and has provided a ton of information about these animals. So first thing to note is that there's some very interesting pigmentation changes that happen over the lifetime of a Taiwanese white dolphin. So you can see in this picture, there's one sort of dark gray individual here who's solid. This is probably a pretty young individual. Calves are actually born solid gray in color, and they gradually lose this dark pigmentation as they grow older. They start off solid dark gray, and then they go to this individual on the top left is a pretty good example of that gray pigmentation starts to fade, and you start to see a little bit of sort of mottling. And then that pigmentation continues to fade until you get a more sort of white or pink spotted animal, until the oldest individuals tend to be sort of more mostly pink. And this loosely correlates with age. So even though a dolphin has reached physical maturity, we can tell an individual is older depending on the amount of sort of pink coloration it has. And these spotting patterns are actually retained over time. So even though they're losing that background pigmentation, there are certain constellations of spots that they actually retain throughout their entire lives. And so these spots can be used along with sort of the typical features in photo ID, like dorsal fin nicks or scars, to identify individual dolphins. So this individual is a great example of this. You can see that this dolphin's getting to be mostly pink, but there are still some very distinctive spots along its dorsal fin, especially this little sort of chevron-shaped bunch of spots there. So actually similar to humpback whales that you might see along the coast of BC. When researchers catalog individuals, we quite often will give them nicknames so it's easy to identify them in the field. So this also happens with humpback dolphins, and this particular humpback dolphin has been nicknamed greater than because that chevron shape looks quite like the greater than sign you might come across in sort of math class. So photo ID has also been really important in defining these animals as a subspecies. So you can see from this figure that researchers actually compared different color phases in Taiwan to two populations that are found along the coast of China. And so you can see that even though the sort of spotting is fading, the Taiwanese dolphins are retaining their spots, especially in the dorsal fin area, throughout all of these different kind of color classes, whereas the dolphins that are found along the coast of China do tend to lose their spots in the dorsal fin area fairly quickly. So this was a pretty key finding to start defining these animals as a separate subspecies. So we do also quite often compare information about these dolphins to other populations of humpback dolphins. So even though they are considered a separate subspecies, the knowledge that has been gained about other populations in other parts of the world is still really invaluable for comparisons. So one of my papers during the course of my PhD, I was looking at different group sizes for different humpback dolphins throughout the world. And so ETS refers to the Eastern Taiwan Strait, Taiwanese white dolphin, and the other populations are found sort of throughout the world. And so you can see that the group sizes, the average group size in the Eastern Taiwan Strait is pretty comparable to most of the other populations of humpback dolphins, excluding the PRE population, which is found in the Pearl River estuary in Hong Kong. So the PRE population is kind of a special case and could probably be the topic of another Tales from the Deep day sometime in the future. But basically comparing Taiwanese white dolphins to other groups of humpback dolphins, they're pretty comparable. And humpback dolphins in Taiwan are quite often observed alone. So they're singletons, just one individual traveling along, which is pretty consistent with other populations of humpback dolphins in other parts of the world, that we have lots of sightings that it's just one dolphin. So a little bit more background information on the biology of these animals. Again, we borrow a lot of our knowledge from nearby populations, especially the animals in the Pearl River estuary are very well studied. And so we get information about things like the diet of these animals and their life history parameters, sort of when they calf, how old they can live to be, that kind of thing, based on mostly stranding data. So when animals die at sea and wash up on a beach, when researchers are able to actually access those carcasses and do a necropsy, they can get a lot of important information about what happens over the course of a dolphin's life. So from stranding data in other parts of the world, we know that humpback dolphins in general are very long-lived and slow to reproduce, which is pretty common with a lot of different cetacean species. Humpback dolphins reach sexual maturity at around 10 or 13 years old, and females can have a calf roughly every 5 years, and they'll usually only have one calf at a time. So it's a really long calving interval, or time between when they have one calf and when they have the next. And we know that some individuals can live to be over 30 years old. There are also some long-lasting associations between mother and calves. So throughout their lives, mothers and calves will have be spending time with one another, as well as with other members of the population on sort of more short-term sort of basis. So I kind of think of it as like there's only about under 75 individuals. It's kind of like a small town or like a small village where kind of everyone knows each other and they sort of all spend a little bit of time together, but you might spend a little bit more time with your family than with the rest of the community, but you do know everybody to say hi, kind of thing. And another interesting observation about these animals, only around 75 in the world, and there have been sightings where over half of the population has been observed in one area during a single sighting. So we had one sighting several years ago that 41 individuals, we actually estimated fewer than that because you can only count so many dolphins when they're all surfacing at different times and all around the boat. But actually looking at photo ID data, we were able to identify 41 different individuals that were all in the same place at one time, which is kind of amazing. And lastly, these animals are considered estuarine opportunistic generalists, which basically just means that they will eat kind of whatever they can find as sort of the opportunity arises. They don't have any specific prey species that they are after, just a wide variety of prey that's found in shallow coastal and estuarine habitats. So part of my research was to look at the habitat characteristics of these animals and what actually entails habitat for humpback dolphins. So I mentioned in the beginning that when we go out and do surveys, we were collecting that sort of opportunistic environmental data when possible, looking at sort of distances from shore, depth, and other environmental characteristics. And so we found that most sightings were made within 1 kilometer of shore, with no sightings being made more than 2.8 kilometers away. And we found most sightings were made in waters that were less than 20 meters deep. And on average, the water depth during sightings about 6 to 7 meters. So generally, these animals are found in shallow, warm, brackish waters. Again, pretty similar to other populations of humpback dolphins in other parts of the world. And since they are those opportunistic generalists, this is likely due to their prey distribution. So it's good eaten in the estuaries and close to shore. So that's where they're spending their time. Looking at population density was pretty interesting. So I basically took all of the sightings that we had made of these dolphins and broke up that as well as our survey efforts, so where we were spending our time when we were out looking for these animals, into different blocks up and down the coast, and looked at the number of sightings within each of those blocks to try and prioritize sort of what areas are being used the most by these dolphins. So this particular figure is showing sightings per unit of effort. So just one sighting is one data point, doesn't matter how many dolphins there are. And over the course of several years, looked at the changes in those densities in each of those individual blocks. And so you can see it's quite variable in each of those different blocks. They're numbered from 1 to 15 from the north to the south if you're having trouble seeing those tiny numbers. But sort of over time, the distribution or sort of the number of sightings in each block can change. It can be really high in one year and really, really low in another. But there are some areas that are consistently high density for these animals. And that's also true when we look at number of dolphins per unit effort, so factoring in the actual group sizes and the count of animals that we see during those sightings, as well as for mother-calf pairs per unit effort. And across all of these different measures, you can see that there are these consistently high areas where we are seeing lots of dolphins. So the next step for me was we surveyed this area. We know where these dolphins are found in the area where we're looking for them, but what about where else they could be found along the west coast of Taiwan? They're not traveling across the Taiwan Strait, but are they going further north or further south? And we're spending our time surveying for them. So I used a method called species distribution modeling, where I basically took our survey data as well as environmental data, which in this case I used remotely sensed environmental layers that are actually measured from satellites, which is really cool. We live in the future, if you weren't sure. So that was really neat, getting to use satellite data. And I put those together into ecological niche models, or species distribution models, they can be called, and used a couple of different model types, including some sort of traditional statistics, as well as some machine learning methods that you might have heard of, all the rage these days, machine learning. And together, these models actually will quantify the relationships between dolphin occurrence and their environment. And this can then be used to predict their distribution outside of where we've actually surveyed for them. So this is ultimately what came out of my predictions. The dark red areas, each of the little tiny pixels that I hope you can all see, is a 1 kilometer block of habitat. And so the areas that are in red are the most models predicted that there would be dolphin occurrence, or that would be suitable habitat. Orange, slightly fewer models, green, fewer than that, and blue, maybe only a couple of models predicted that might be suitable habitat for these dolphins. And so basically the takeaway from this I took is that these predictions really confirm what we had previously defined 10 years ago as priority habitat for these animals. Dr. Peter Ross, who's our VP of research here at OceanWise, has been involved with the Taiwanese white dolphin for many years, and he was part of the group that defined this priority habitat based on where we were seeing these animals as being waters that are less than 30 meters deep or within 3 kilometers of shore. And the purpose of that designation was to sort of show a tangible area that needs to be protected for these animals going forward. And so my models, getting much more technical into the data, but ultimately ends up supporting this expert recommendation for priority habitat to be protected for these animals. And so now we know where they're found, we know what their habitat is, we know what habitat we need to look after. We need to address the threats within that habitat to ensure the survival of these animals. So the major threats that have been identified by an international panel of experts include habitat degradation and loss, air and water pollution, interactions with fisheries, as well as underwater noise. So I'll give a little bit of context about Taiwan. Why are there so many conservation issues along the West Coast? It's one of the most densely populated places in the entire world. I did a quick Google, and Wikipedia tells me that Taiwan is the 17th most densely populated country in the whole world. And I think that doesn't take into account the fact that a lot of the island is mountains that people don't live on. So actually the west coast of Taiwan, you can see this sort of brownish area is relatively flat, and most of the population of Taiwan lives just in those kinds of areas. So Taiwan as an island is roughly the same size as Vancouver Island, difference of about 5,000 square kilometers. And the population of Taiwan is actually 28 million people. So to put that into context, that would be like taking the population of Canada's 3 most populous provinces and cramming them all onto Vancouver Island to get an idea of the population density. So there's a lot of people and really not enough space. And the dolphins are competing with people for that space. So the first impact I'll sort of talk about for habitat degradation is the reduction of freshwater flow to estuaries. So there are several major rivers that meet the sea along the west coast of Taiwan. I've highlighted just a few here, but there are actually more that you can actually see along this map that I haven't even labeled, but tons of different rivers. But a lot of these have actually been diverted. There are so many people and so much industry along the west coast of Taiwan that that water has been diverted and taken to be used for irrigation for agriculture, various industrial uses, as well as hydroelectric power generation and just household use of people needing sort of drinking water and cleaning water and that sort of thing. So we know that rivers are very important for these dolphins. 92% of our sightings were made within 10 kilometers of a river. That being said, there aren't too many areas along the west coast of Taiwan that are more than 10 kilometers from a river, but that's where the animals are spending all of their time. So the fact that about a third of the annual flow of one of the largest rivers along the west coast of Taiwan about a third of that river flow is what's making it into that estuary, is pretty concerning. And so you recall this figure from sort of earlier when I was talking about densities, and this area adjacent to the Juoshuel River is actually one of the lowest density areas that these dolphins are found. So dolphins are not spending their time adjacent to that river. It could be potentially because there is so little water flow. So this is actually an image of the Juoshuel River. This is one of the largest rivers. This is what it would look like when there's not too much water going through, but there is a wet and dry season cycle in Taiwan, that in the summer months is the wet season, and there can be typhoons and like huge rainfalls that this entire river basin might be sort of like flowing with water. But in the dry season, even this little sort of trickle that's coming through might be even less. So the effects of that water being diverted from this particular river may be even worse during the dry season. And so this could really be changing the ecosystem in that estuary. So it could be affecting the abundance and diversity of fish species that are found there and depleting their food resources. The dolphins aren't really finding what they're looking for a meal right next to this river. So this is just another image to really visualize where the population density is along the west coast of Taiwan. To also emphasize, I mentioned those sort of brown flat areas. It also is very sandy. So the coastline of Taiwan, where sort of all the people live, also happens to be sandy substrate that every year some amount of sand, an actual like coastline, could be lost into the ocean just from erosion and flooding, that sort of thing. So in response to that, the government has altered a lot of the coastline for erosion and flooding control and replaced that sandy substrate with concrete to try and mitigate the effect of that land just being lost into the ocean. And so that is further changing the sort of ecosystem and the habitat, because there's now rocky coastline where there used to be sand. And so that might be sort of not the ideal habitat ecosystem for the kind of fish that these dolphins would be looking for. And so this is just an example of the kind of concrete that is placed along most of the coastline of Taiwan. This is actually a pier that's jutting out about sort of halfway up the coastline, but you get the idea that all of these sort of spiky looking gray bits are all those big, they're called tetrapods, that are all just sort of dropped in areas to try and mitigate the effects of sort of erosion and waves hitting the sand and that sort of thing. A further issue for these animals is land reclamation. So as if altering their coastline wasn't enough, people are also entirely taking habitat away from these dolphins. So since there's so little room along the west coast of Taiwan, it's very expensive to try and develop industry there, for example. So this has been solved by land reclamation, where an area of the coastline is actually sort of walled off, and it's all filled in with sort of sand and other soil, so that industrial parks can actually be built on top of that reclaimed land. And so there are lots of different land reclamations along the coast of Taiwan. I've just highlighted 4 of them here. And we actually find that there's very high number of dolphins and number of mother-calf pairs adjacent to these major land reclamations. And if you recall, again, that the 2 circled areas are the areas of especially high dolphin density, which overlap with 3 of the 4 that I've highlighted here, land reclamations. So this could be because these reclamations are quite often placed near major rivers, sometimes to make use of that natural water source that's coming in. So it could just be a coincidence that dolphins spend time near rivers and these reclamation projects happen to be built on rivers. It could be also that these areas may have been important for these dolphins prior to construction. So I mentioned that these animals are very long-lived. There are some members of the population that potentially could have been using these areas before these construction projects actually happened. it's possible that they spent time in certain areas looking after their own calves or as sort of juveniles. And then as time has gone on, they sort of return to those areas despite the degradation and sort of ongoing construction that has happened. And it could just be that these animals have such a restricted range that they don't have anywhere else to go. So this is not ideal habitat. They're losing chunks of the habitat, and they really don't have anywhere else that they can find the food that they need and the areas that they want to spend their time. And this is especially concerning because there are always more developments being planned. For example, right now, Taiwan is working on transitioning to renewable energy sources, which is great, but they are looking at putting offshore wind farms adjacent to these dolphins' habitat, which in addition to, hopefully they will mostly be located offshore, but just the construction phase and all of the other sort of effects of putting up wind farms in this very sensitive habitat is really concerning for those of us who are following these animals. So pollution is another major threat, as you can imagine, with all of these sort of industrial areas along the coast of Taiwan. There are, as of 2007, there were 623 factories within 1 kilometer of the shoreline. I'm sure there are more now. And so there are huge issues with air and water pollution. And the main pollution issue for these dolphins is probably that their prey is very contaminated. So things like heavy metals and persistent organic pollutants will bioaccumulate. So fish will consume their prey in this environment and consume those sort of pollutants. And then as dolphins eat more and more fish, it gets sort of magnified, the concentrations of those pollutants that end up in the dolphins themselves. And so these can have really adverse effects on the immune system, their reproduction, and other body development and function. And there was a modeling study that was done a few years ago that predicted that the majority of Taiwanese white dolphins have very high loads of polychlorinated biphenyls, which I believe are fire retardants that are put in a lot of different products. And this modeling study also showed that mature male dolphins and neonates, so that's newborn calves, are likely to be the most heavily burdened and at highest risk of immunotoxicity. And females are included in that highest risk group because females can actually offload some of their contaminants to their offspring through lactation. So a lot of these different contaminants are fat soluble. And so, of course, the milk that mammals produce is very high in fat. And so those pollutants can end up in that milk and getting passed on to calves. So really bad news for a female having her first calf because she has accumulated all of this, all of these contaminants over the first like 10 to 15 years of her life. And then the very first calf she has is going to receive a really high dosage through lactation and through nursing. So that calf will very likely not survive. But that does mean for the female that now her contaminant load is decreased and she might have a better sort of prognosis going forward for the rest of her life and for her future calves. So another major threat for these animals is fisheries interactions. So especially gill nets and trammel nets. So there are lots of different types of fishing gear that are used, and these two particular types are the most dangerous for these dolphins. That's because they're basically set, anchored to the bottom of the seafloor, and just cover like a huge area. So it's just a wall of netting that goes across portions of the habitat. And quite often these nets can be set so that they're not like taut, they're not completely like tight, which that can make it a little bit easier that if a dolphin runs into a netting, if the netting is pulled tight, they can free themselves sometimes. But if the nets aren't set correctly, or in the case of trammel nets, which are designed to entangle fish, they have sort of loose sections that dolphins can end up getting entangled in, which is really dangerous. And a study a few years ago found that over 30% of the population actually carries injuries due to fishing gear. So there are cases where researchers will be out there doing photo ID and they will find animals that are actively entangled. So you can see the first top two photos. These animals both have fishing line in the case of picture A, just wrapped around. And in the case of picture B, this individual actually has two lines that have sort of worked their way into her flesh of her dorsal hump and her dorsal fin. So there's a case study that's out there if you're interested in reading more about that. I won't get into the gruesome details. But in addition to actually observing active entanglements as they're happening, individuals in the population have tons of injuries that indicate that in the past they have had some kind of fisheries interaction and been entangled in some form or another. So it's not all doom and gloom. There is a recovery plan that has been put together by an international committee of experts, actually almost a year ago to the day, I think. They got together and put together these recommendations for this recovery plan, putting forward 6 immediate actions that the Taiwanese government can put into place to try and save these animals and work on their recovery. And those address the threats that I just covered, things like banning gill and trammel nets within the dolphin habitat. Any new developments like wind farms or other land reclamations should be done completely outside of Taiwanese dolphin habitat. Vessels should have mandatory routes and speed limits to reduce noise and the risk of vessel strikes. And they should be really aiming to reduce pollution of the air, water, and soil along the west coast of Taiwan. Increasing natural river flows is, of course, important. And we want to establish some regulations to limit human-caused underwater noise levels. I didn't get too much into underwater noise here because we're sort of, I think, running out of time and would love to have time for questions. But if you have any questions about underwater noise, I can answer those later. And in addition to actions that the Taiwanese government can take, there's also this group of international experts sort of prioritized various different research topics. So looking at the most important of these research topics are things that are looking at sort of the health of the population, looking at trends in abundance, estimating life history characteristics and that sort of thing, looking at how their distribution and habitat use is changing over time. And then further down the priority list is things that are interesting to know, especially for this particular population, because a lot of this information we have gathered from other populations of humpback dolphins. But we have enough information that we can make the recommendations for the recovery, for the actions that need to be done. So that's why those are sort of lower down on the list. So just wrapping up, as I mentioned, Taiwanese white dolphins are Taiwan's only endemic cetacean, and they are facing extinction due entirely to human activities, which is very concerning. The recovery plan that's been developed are mostly measures that are to be put in place by the Taiwanese government, and it is very it's all the way over there. We kind of can't really have too much of an effect. How do I, in my life, make changes that I can do something to help the Taiwanese white dolphins? But there are ways, and I'll leave you with the quote. The most environmentally friendly product is the one you didn't buy. So this relates to Taiwan and Taiwanese white dolphins because a lot of the industry that happens along the west coast where these dolphins are found is manufacturing items that we consume here in North America and in the West. So a lot of plastic manufacturing, that sort of thing gets exported and comes over to us. So I'm not going to sort of sit here and preach and say everyone should become a minimalist and don't buy things, that sort of thing. We all have sort of necessities in our lives. But think about the purchases you're making, and do you need a new iPhone every year? Maybe not. Maybe that one that I have right now can stretch out for a couple of years. And just making conscious purchases and conscious consumption, reducing our consumption, can have a huge impact for these dolphins in particular, as well as other cetacean species that are found in other parts of the world that do have industries that are very focused on manufacturing for Western markets. So I'll leave it there, and we can hopefully have a little bit of time for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lauren. I learned a lot about the Taiwanese white dolphin that I didn't know before, and I hope our audience did too. So we would absolutely love to have some questions from our audience. So we really welcome you to put that in the chat for me to pass along. We already have a couple of questions that have come through. And one of the first ones was, having kind of worked in Taiwan for your research and maybe some of the ongoing conversations, how likely do you think it is that the Taiwanese government would kind of follow through and really be successful in the recovery plan that you talked about?
That's a great question. And it's hard to really say, especially I haven't been to Taiwan in several years now, and wouldn't necessarily be having sort of the conversations with the government myself, or with government sort of representatives. But we're optimistic. I mean, the recovery plan puts forth very measurable and achievable goals, we think. And so really the goal is to try and work with the government and put sort of pressure where we need to, supply more information where possible, to try and convince them and help as much as we can to sort of put that into place and ensure that these animals are being protected.
Fingers crossed then.
The
Another question was, it's great to be raising awareness about these animals here through the Tales from the Deep program, but would you say that there is a cultural connection in Taiwan to the Taiwanese white dolphin, or like how much do people there know about them and maybe some of their struggles?
That's another great question. I think it varies a lot, because I have met international students here in Canada who are from Taiwan who said, I had no idea we had pink dolphins in Taiwan. What are you even talking about? Whereas there are also, these animals have a bit of a spiritual significance to Indigenous peoples in Taiwan. And there has been more effort in recent years to spread awareness within Taiwan about these animals, and to get people sort of as excited about their conservation and protecting them as people here in BC are passionate about southern resident killer whales and their protection. So there's been sort of some on-the-ground outreach in Taiwan to try and educate people more about these animals. And really, I think also the designation that the Taiwanese white dolphin is a subspecies and it is Taiwan's only endemic cetacean, goes pretty far in trying to convince people that these animals are valuable and worth protecting, and they are important to Taiwan's sort of cultural identity. So we hope that sort of as the efforts go forward, interest and enthusiasm for protecting these animals continues to grow.
Wonderful. Yeah, I mean, I have to say it's been great to see the kind of enthusiasm grow here on the West Coast for the southern resident killer whales, as you mentioned. And I think that's always such an important part in kind of moving the government to make those necessary changes. So it's nice to hear that that's the conversation that's starting to happen there as well. You encouraged some questions about noise pollution, and so we have some of those coming in from our audience. One being kind of how do these large shipments, whether it's across the Pacific, be in our direction, or through kind of the across to China, how do shipping containers affect echolocation and kind of maybe disturb these animals?
Yeah. For these dolphins in particular, I think we kind of think of just sort of whales in general when we think of shipping traffic. But it can vary a little bit depending on what kind of cetacean you're talking about. So for these dolphins in particular, they're small cetacean, they're odontocetes, which means they have teeth, and they also use echolocation, whereas in contrast to blue whales, humpback whales, sort of the baleen species that don't actually use echolocation, sound is still very important for them. But for the small cetaceans, dolphins, porpoises, killer whales included, their communication range and the frequency at which they communicate tends to be, I think, a little bit higher than shipping traffic. So it wouldn't necessarily interfere with their communication sort of directly, but it does sort of build up, and it's kind of like, it wouldn't completely like mask it entirely, I believe, but it will make it harder. And it's kind of like in other areas, we wonder whether or not these dolphins are like shouting to each other to make sure that they're heard. So they're not completely getting like drowned out necessarily, but it might be harder for them to communicate. In terms of echolocation, that's a good question. It probably does, affect their echolocation as well, and sort of their navigation, their ability to find prey. And the other thing to think about with shipping traffic is, even if the noise that's being made by shipping traffic is, even if it's not necessarily directly impacting their communication, it can stress these animals out. So if there's like a sudden loud noise, they might flee from an area, which increases their risk of entanglement. And it could also just be like a chronic kind of annoyance that is stressing them out. So if you think about sort of like, I had outside my apartment today, somebody mowing the lawn for, it felt like hours, and it was a little stressful and a little bit annoying. So my stress levels were a little bit raised. And so that might also be the case for these dolphins as well, with underwater noise in their habitat, that like they have enough challenges already. If we can do anything to remove any kind of additional stressor, any kind of additional sort of problem for them, it would benefit them immensely.
I was exactly on the same wavelength as you when you were talking about noise disturbance and comparing it to, you know, maybe working from home or having that kind of noise. Definitely, it's I hope that many of our participants today can kind of think at a time where there was maybe an extended period of noise and sort of how that made them feel, and definitely adds to kind of stress levels if you're already having a challenging time too, or even just regular day to day. I was curious about the kind of some of the land reclamation, and you were talking about some of the concrete that was going along the coast. That was a really interesting picture about, oh, I can hear a siren in the background, some already background noise. But having some of those kind of spiky pylons, do you know, or I think you refer to them as tetrapods, do you know kind of if they have benefits to that structure, or if there's maybe a cement coastline that could be implemented that would be more environmentally friendly to these animals?
Well, there's two kind of slightly different issues with land reclamation. The reclamation itself, removing habitat, is really detrimental. There's so little for these animals that filling it in is really, really counter to them continuing and kind of doing well. And the tetrapods are for erosion control. So they're building more land using the land, by land reclamation, and then those tetrapods are even along sort of like sandy beaches. Those have been placed there to try and avoid sort of erosion. Is there another option for coastline to sort of mitigate erosion control? That's a great question, and I don't actually know. I am not an expert on that sort of almost like an engineering problem. That I'm not sure. That's sort of what they've gone with in Taiwan, I think, for kind of decades. And it also happens to be Taiwan produces a lot of concrete, so might just be sort of a convenient use for the concrete that they're sort of already producing to put it sort of in that area. But I would be interested to see more studies on sort of fisheries in the area, and whether or not the sort of hard substrate of those tetrapods is creating like reefs or that sort of thing. That's one of the things that came up with when we were talking about wind farms being built. It's like maybe there could be a bit of a benefit to these dolphins that these wind farms going in is going to create like an artificial reef. It could draw fish in, which is a possibility, but we also don't necessarily know what these dolphins are eating because we're borrowing that information from other populations. And we don't necessarily know where those fish are spending their whole, like, different parts of their life cycle. So it could be that these fish do actually spend time in rocky habitats, and maybe the tetrapods being there is not really taking away that much from their sort of the fish habitat there. But there really isn't much information in the way of sort of these fish distributions in all of these different estuaries to really know what the effect is or start thinking about kind of recommendations going forward. It would also be really hard to undo the work that's been done along the coast of Taiwan, removing those tetrapods, because they kind of sink into the sand along the beaches and sort of disappear into the sand, and then more are kind of put on top, I believe. So there's probably kind of layers and layers of them in there. So that would be a pretty huge undertaking to try and undo that coastal reclamation and what's the word I'm trying to think of? Change is the simple word.
Absolutely. Well, I think those are some kind of great questions to even put out to our audience to think about, is that there are always, there's more work to be done, more questions to be answered, and some, interesting kind of design challenges to think about too. What other options for reducing erosion are out there that might be more friendly to some of these animals. A question that came in from our audience was, how did you get into this area of work? What brought you to studying the Taiwanese white dolphin?
I have a kind of funny answer to this question, which most people don't find very helpful, unfortunately, but I ended up studying these animals by accident. So I did my undergrad in science in biology, and it was very lab-based, and I thought that was super cool. And I really enjoyed the research part and doing labs and that kind of thing. I also happened to go to a university that was very focused on lab work rather than sort of in the field and ecology and that kind of side. So that's what I thought my future was going to be. And so I got towards the end of my undergrad and decided I wanted to go to grad school, and sort of was looking up different programs, different projects, and came across Trent University in Peterborough, Ontario is where I ended up, and was actually interested in like a totally different project, studying like wolves. So I was looking at terrestrial species, and I was actually planning on doing sort of more kind of genetic stuff, more lab-based work. And I met my new supervisor at Trent, and he said, "Hey, we have this neat project of these dolphins in Taiwan. And so you'd have to go into the field and like go, and all this data has been collected. You can go and see these animals, and we have a couple of different sort of options for things we're interested in studying in terms of research questions. You can kind of whatever you want to do with those." And I was just like, okay, that sounds great. So I was really interested just in research in general, and have just kind of stumbled along as sort of opportunities arose. And just I think it's just important to do a lot of different things throughout your education. Try different internships if you are fortunate enough to be able to go and do those kinds of placements in different places, do different co-ops, study different things, watch online lectures like this, where you sort of learn about all of the different options of things that there are to do. And just if something sounds interesting, like go and try it. And if you don't like it, that's fine, try something else. And you kind of narrow down what you're interested in. You might stumble into something that you quite enjoy and decide to make your career, as I have.
I love that as an answer. And I think that's a really kind of great thing to think about. It's wonderful to see that we have some university students in the audience today, even thinking about how could they get more involved with OceanWise and OceanWise research. And I think just the examples that you listed, to try many things, to keep an eye out for, different internships and positions that maybe even not what you were originally planning connecting to, but if it strikes your interest, there's a great opportunity there. And so I'll put into the chat the link to our OceanWise research website. You can kind of see the team, and definitely staying connected to the Tales from the Deep programs. You can look at what kind of work OceanWise is doing and see if there might be a pathway to explore there. I definitely have had a kind of similar experience even with education and getting into online learning, was that it was really kind of saying yes to a variety of opportunities. So I completely agree that that's a great way to go. We are at the end of today's program, so I really want to thank you so much, Lauren, for answering all of the questions and telling us so much about these great animals. And we look forward to keeping an eye out and connecting to more opportunities to learn about this. And I loved your idea of a different or next Tales from the Deep, talking about other species that are nearby and connecting to these animals again.